Okay, the 2017 session of the Local Officers Compensation Commission is called to order. I'm going to start with the roll call. Roger Hewitt.
Here.
Edwin Harwood.
Here.
Robert Picken.
Here.
Shoshana Haran.
Here.
Juliet Pressel.
Here.
Carrie Chesney.
Here.
Brian Weinert.
Here.
So the first item on the agenda is the election of a chairperson for the session. So we'll entertain nominations.
I think the question is actually who's willing to volunteer.
We'll entertain volunteers for nominations.
I will nominate Julia as the,
Is there a second?
Yeah, second.
And anyone opposed? All right, it is done. Juliet, you are the chair.
Okay.
Congratulations.
Well, the next order of business on the agenda is approval of the agenda. Has everybody had a chance to take a look at it? Is there anybody who has a problem with approving the agenda? Is there a nomination to approve the agenda?
I move that we approve the agenda.
A second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. It's approved. We have no members of the public at present that I'm going to include myself for a minute. I want to give a shout out to Dave Askins to thank him and to also apologize to him because it was his tenacity and his gentle commitment and urging that had us deciding that we were going to meet within the first 3 months, if at all possible, of the year in which we were going to be meeting, and we didn't do it. And I spent the last year and a half occupied with my own issues and did not give it a second thought until the beginning of September. So, Dave, wherever you are, thanks for being the voice of our conscience. Anybody else want to say anything? Okay. Next order of business is approval of minutes. And that is section 2 of the binder that we've been given. Thank you, Bruce. Thank you. What we're receiving right now is the resolution the draft resolution that Dave offered us as a member of the public last time, and that is an attachment to the minutes. So let's take a few minutes to review the minutes and the resolution. What I would like to mention, and this is by way of addressing the actual minutes, this was not quite what the LOCC actually resolved, but we accepted, and those of you who were here last time, please correct me if I'm wrong, but as I recall, we did not accept the proposed resolution that we set our first meeting of 2017 for Monday, January 9th. What we decided instead was that we would make best efforts to meet in the first 3 months of the calendar year. And the purpose of that was to ensure that if any changes were going to be made to the budget, that that would happen before the proposed budget had been offered and approved. I believe that the second of the 3 proposed resolutions was adopted by us, and I believe that the third one was as well, so that we would make best efforts to ensure that we were recorded on CTN, which is in fact happening, and that we would make best efforts to ensure that all written materials to be considered at the scheduled meetings are available well in advance of the meetings in digital form online. And I don't know how close we've come, but I think we're making improvements. So, to some, I believe that my comment on the minutes is that, at least as to this needs to be fleshed out a little bit. At least I wanted it on the record that what the LOCC actually adopted as its resolution was different in that one respect, which was that we did not accept the proposal of setting the meeting at January 9th. So, does anybody else have comments on the minutes?
I think you're correct that that date certain was not included
No.
in the resolution.
No.
Just-
Sorry.
I'll just note that I'll abstain since I wasn't at that.
Okay. Anybody else? Chris, I don't know.
Yeah,
no.
so if you want to move, I can add that resolution,
Yeah,
the
so
actual resolution, if you
I
want to
would,
move that.
and
and
I know
have
you're
that
going to
approved.
make best efforts to find it.
Yep,
I know
it's
that
in here
you are-
somewhere.
I know that you're succeeding to somebody else's position. So with that proposed change, is there a motion to approve the minutes?
So moved?
Second? All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, moving on. Go back to the agenda here. So, commission business, a resolution to determine salaries of mayor and city council members. And that is, again, that's attachment, or section 3.
And I just want to point out, this is just a draft resolution
Okay,
premised on no change. You're
Uh-huh.
welcome to make any changes to this that you decide.
okay. Any discussion? Folks, somebody else besides me has to talk.
So this is essentially a resolution to keep it as is?
Yeah, I think what you did was you just produced a resolution that could be the default resolution or could change.
Yes.
So this is what it would look like.
And you had mentioned that there was discussion about an alternate resolution that Dave had proposed?
The alternate resolution that Dave had proposed was what I discussed earlier, that we would, when we would meet and having the meetings made public and the materials made public.
But nothing related actually to
No.
salary? Okay,
No.
gotcha.
Anybody? Go ahead.
Chris, do you know what the cost of living increase has been for either the cost of living locally increase and also what the average increase in wages for city employees have been over this period, I guess in the last year?
I don't have the cost of living increase. The city employee changes I could get for you, but I don't have it with me now. Again, some of those are collective bargaining agreements for the
Correct.
union folks, and then the non-union is individual salaries.
Yeah.
So.
I think it would be helpful if we would have use those as sort of benchmarks of, again, either the cost of living or what is typical for non-union employees of the city.
For the past 12 months, according to the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, the consumer price index for all urban consumers rose 0.4% in August and 1.9% for the 12 months. Just putting that out there.
So somewhere around 2%, which is what my understanding has been.
Anybody else like to speak?
I wonder, last time, almost 2 years ago, we spent a whole lot of time pulling together all kinds of data from other communities, union agreements, non-union agreements, cities in Michigan, cities outside of Michigan, and then we ended up just kind of really pulling a number out, 1%, and approve that 1%. I wonder if we can be more rational and agree on a standard, whether it's the consumer price index, whether it's the average non-union compensation in the city, but just, come to a consensus on what a reasonable, rational benchmark is for this compensation and agree to that level going forward. And I also wonder, and this may be a question for the city attorney's office, are we obligated to continue meeting on an every other year basis to go through this exercise? Or could we put into city code or recommend an action that would basically institutionalize that rational standard for compensation going forward, so we don't go through this. I just think there's so many better ways that city staff, that us, can be spending our time. And if we can agree on a reasonable standard to move this forward, I feel like that ultimately the decision last time was a purely political one ultimately. Why not set a standard that makes sense and use that as the standard going forward?
I think most organizations would look at a couple of factors, some of them that were already mentioned. One is the rest of the city employees, bargained or the non-bargaining unit group, what has been allowed for them. So that's a comparator. What's going on locally, maybe what's going on with nonprofits. I mean, whatever we select, we could identify those items and go back to them every year and kind of do a bit of a sense test, and ultimately, there'd be an affordability piece. I mean, if the city was really in trouble, maybe we can't afford to raise salaries one year, for example. But that would be another factor that you could build into a bit of a decision model to look at that and come up with something that seemed to be rational, seemed to be fair, and then ultimately seemed to be non-political.
Yes.
Yeah, and by fair, it's fair to the city, but also fair to the people that would receive the increased benefits.
I'm wondering, and I know this was a question that came up before, according to the notes I was seeing, how the time has changed the culture of one council to the next, from one decade to the next, in terms of, is it a 10-hour week commitment? Is it an 80-hour week commitment? And I think that changes based on how different administrators run. And so there's some sense of that, I think, is worth at least paying attention to. Because if they're expected to have many hours in council meetings and committee meetings, that's a different level of commitment.
I can actually
within that.
address that somewhat from what we discussed last time. Part of the reason that we chose to ignore information for surrounding localities is that it doesn't matter. Everybody has their own budget, their own needs, and so it doesn't matter what they pay in Grand Rapids or Lansing, at least as we saw it at the time. What we did ask was exactly what you're asking. Folks, how much time do you spend doing this? And the answers varied considerably. Those that actually gave us answers, some chose to give generic answers, and the bottom line was that this is a job that can eat up every spare ounce of your time if you are willing to let that happen. I think most of the city council people have other jobs because this is not, this is not survival wages. But in the end, what we felt was that we've got a group of very committed people whose efforts range from, it helps them to keep their mental balance, not to invest that much time, to people who are full steam ahead all the time. We also heard basically that they weren't that concerned about their salaries, and Chris Taylor even came out and said, hey, if you never raise our salaries, we're fine with it. Now, he was speaking for himself, but I think that was a general consensus. And I would add that part of the reason that our meeting last time was of significance was that it had been many years since there had been an increase in the salary at all. And that comes to what you were talking about a little bit. ultimately, any resolution by the LOCC has to be approved by the city council. So there were earlier years in which LOCC recommendation was for an increase, and the city council said, no, this isn't the time or the place. So I think it had been perhaps 9 years since there had been an increase. So if we were to adopt, a position that if our budget affords it, if the economy affords it, that there should be a standard increase, that would still, I assume, be subject, we would want to make it subject to city council approval, and if they felt that it was inappropriate or unnecessary, they could say so.
To your question about the hours per week, I don't know if you saw in the notes there from the last meeting, it was a conservative average of 20 to 25 hours.
Right.
And that was done based on the survey, so that was a bit of self-reporting, but
So it's okay, I was curious about the method,
Yeah.
thanks.
Yeah, I'd certainly agree that having some formula is a good idea, but again, you'll go through financial times where it may just not be appropriate. And I think probably legally, we have to meet every 2 years under state law anyway, I'm not sure. But if we've got a formula and, times are good, we'll stick with the formula, times are bad. We could limit this to one meeting instead of multiple meetings. And again, I get the impression that the city council isn't that concerned about what their salaries are. We've got a form in place. I would think some formula, whichever formula we might decide to use, would be, certainly a reasonable approach, and not having to go through the entire process every 2 years. So,
Yeah, and I would add that, I think that we obviously came to consensus, and council ultimately did approve the package that was provided the last time around. So I think we have a consensus, and I think there's a general consensus on council that the amount that's currently in place is fairly reasonable. But the cost of living does go up over time. And if we believed 2 years ago that that was a reasonable level of compensation, I guess my feeling is, and if the cost of living has gone up by 1.9%, it would seem reasonable to say, if we thought that that baseline was an appropriate salary for this position, that we would increase the compensation based on the reality of how the economy is performing. Taking into account if the city's in financial crisis or something like that, a mitigating circumstance that would say, well, you know what, this time around, we're really not in a position to offer this for these reasons. I think it's a fair point to make.
Thanks.
Now, as I recall, the 1% that we recommended was broken into two parts. The first increase was 0.5%, and the second increase then brought it up to a full 1%.
The full 1%, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And what you're proposing is basically a default resolution that we would, agree with or disagree with or toggle. I don't know that it would prevent us from having to meet, but it certainly gives us a baseline from which to operate rather than zero.
Yeah.
Um,
Mhm.
Just because the budget for this year is already in progress, I guess, does the budget currently account for that kind of increase for this year? Does that cause issues?
Not to my knowledge.
It's based on the current salaries, but
Okay.
if it needs to be changed in the next budget cycle, it can be.
Okay.
The salaries you determine must be paid, so the budget would be adjusted.
Okay, understood.
But the budget would be adjusted for the next fiscal year.
The pay, the way the current resolution is structured, the pay would be effective on the first of the year. So it would be paid from the first of the year, and if the budget needed to be adjusted, either in the normal budget cycle or even outside the budget cycle, it could be.
So if we approve something that is, pardon me, effective the first of the year, that would have really just half a budget cycle effect, because the budget starts in July 1st, if I'm
Yes,
not
I
mistaken.
don't believe that would require any change outside of the budget cycle, depending on, of course, how much you want to increase it,
Yeah.
obviously.
Okay.
But yeah, 1%, 2%, I don't believe would require any
Okay.
outside of cycle changes.
So assuming that I'm getting a general sense that there's a feeling that if we can create some standardization, at least as a starting point for when we meet every other year, can we get a little conversation on what that standard might be. Is it as simple as the consumer price index for the past 12-month period that we're examining? Are we looking at a longer-term cost of living at a national level? I don't know if there are regional statistics on that. Do we want to use the non-union compensation average for city employees? Are there other measures that we could reasonably argue is that would be a fair way to approach this, at least as a baseline?
Well, oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I believe there are regional, even local consumer price index, and I would think we want to use the local one, because if you look at all of metropolitan Detroit, Ann Arbor would certainly be different than significant sections of metropolitan Detroit as far as cost of living increase. At least that's my outside view, but I would suspect the statistics would back that up. So I would say, let's use the local Ann Arbor CPI and maybe take what the non-union compensation is, average the two together. So if one's 2% and one's 1%, we give 1.5%. As a starting point for discussion, again, depending on the economic situation. But if we had a standard resolution of that, we could at least, we'd be starting this meeting on discussing, is this seem fair given the current circumstances?
So would you be proposing half of that one year and then half of that the next year, or for both
No,
years?
so say it comes out to 2%. Say 2% the first year and then another 2% the second year. Because that's what the actual cost of living would be over. It would be a 2% and then another 2% over that 2-year period. And again, if we come back and find out we were way off, that either prices went up a lot or there was deflation, we could certainly look and say, okay, well, we have to compensate for that. Our 2-year, we had to use the best numbers we had at the time. We were way off of what the future looked like. So let's, on the next meeting, 2 years from now, we'll look at that and say, was this legitimate, or should we scale this down or up based on what happened in the last 2 years?
So I have a question. Is there anything preventing us from, rather than coming in and talking about a 2-year period, of just coming in annually and just looking at for 1 year going forward?
You can set the compensation for just 1 year if you want, but you are only able to meet in the odd years. You cannot meet in the even years,
Per,
per the statute.
The statute says we cannot meet in even years, or just that we must meet in odd years?
There is an Attorney General's opinion that says you cannot. So
So did that Attorney General's opinion mean that we don't have the choice to meet only in even years, or that do you believe that it precludes us meeting in even years if we decide we want to?
yeah, the statute provides that you must meet in odd-numbered years, and the opinion provides that finds that you can't meet in even years, rather.
Is that
So-
because elections are in even years?
That's just the way the
that.
statute is
Okay.
written. I don't know if there's any particular reason
Yeah.
for it, but,
So that's the Attorney General's opinion.
yeah.
Which, speaking as a lawyer, I know is, it's advisory bulletin. I actually think it's a good idea for us to meet in even years as well as odd years. We would not be in dereliction of our duty if we met in even years as well as odd years. We're just adding to a responsibility, we're not subtracting from it.
Yeah, but I mean, I guess I would want to look into that some more and provide some legal advice on that, if that was the desire of the body.
Yeah.
Um,
So I'm willing to move that we do indeed ask you to explore that, because we're not talking about avoiding meeting in odd years. We're talking about making a point of doing this once a year. Second?
Second?
Okay. All in favor?
all right.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay.
So I have another question. So is there any reason why we have to make the increases effective in January? I mean, part of the discussion we had 2 years ago was, let's get out in front of this, get out of the budget cycle, let's look at all these factors going forward, and then if we agree and recommend something going forward, it would be in effect at a time in the future. I mean, in terms of best practice, I mean, personally, that is something I would prefer as opposed to going retro. Then you don't get into the budget deficits and adjustments, whatever. Is there anything that prevents us from doing that, to change the review period or the effective period from January, say, to align with the fiscal year?
No.
Yeah.
You can
That
set
would
it however,
certainly-
you can set the increases whenever you want, or
Yeah.
decreases, or
It
whatever.
would certainly make sense to have the increases start on July 1st, so it could be incorporated into the budget. If we were making a decision before by the previous December, there's plenty of time to incorporate whatever changes are made. And of course, they'll have a pretty insignificant impact on the overall budget, but at least they can put a hard number in.
I think if you were to do something like that, you would probably consider accounting for the transition to July, so maybe if the go-forward was a 2% over 2 years, maybe it's a 2.3 to make up for the first 6 months, but there's ways to do that.
Yeah.
So are we proposing it now, or are we still basically discussing this?
We're discussing, I think we'd be asking for, Chris, for more information on the wages and the CPI before we could, make a final decision. But I think if the framework, we seem to be, unless I'm not hearing anybody saying otherwise, the framework seems to be some combined increase based on CPI and non-union city salaries, and starting on July 1st, the start of the fiscal year.
So that's the proposal at this point.
My question would be to what weights are we gonna put on those numbers? I mean, in your framework,
Mhm.
because you use 50/50, are you gonna put more weight on one over the other? If you look at that, tab 7, there's some, examples of different cities and how their compensation review goes and what they use, and, CPI is a common practice, but it doesn't talk at all about, weights and, if they have a formula set up. So before we made any motion, I'd like to hear a little bit more about that myself.
I think that honestly, until we know what those numbers are, it's not going to make sense to us.
But would you be making your weights based on what the numbers are, or would you be giving weights to what the numbers mean? So in other words, I mean, because the second step, it sounded like in the framework, was to say, okay, we're gonna put this framework together, here's kind of what it gives us, and then can we fit that into the budget? Does it make sense financially for the city? And if it doesn't, then make the adjustments on the back end of it. That's kind of that's how I interpreted that, and you can tell me if you were wrong. Otherwise, I feel like you're gonna get into every year sitting down and saying, here's our factors, now let's determine each 2 years what percentages of each one.
No,
we're
I
gonna
think
do.
whatever we decide the mix is, that should be a number we agree is whether it's 50/50 or something else. I think we ought to say that's in our framework. Every 2 years, if someone wants to bring it up and say, I don't think that's correct, I think we need to look at something else. The commission certainly has the right to do that. But I think if we start off with something, then someone has to have that we all agree on, then someone has to have a legitimate reason for changing that.
Do we have any information about how it was originally set? How the salaries were originally set? I'm just going through some of the other best practices, and, I mean, Columbia, Missouri compensation is voted on by the public as a stipend. That's certainly the most interesting to me. If nothing else, I don't know if it's a good idea or a bad idea, but it would be entertaining. And so it just made me curious, how did we originally, was it established in 1997, or is that just as far back
I
as
think
our?
that's as far back as it goes.
That's as far back as our data goes?
I don't know how it was originally
Okay.
set.
There are a couple of factors that I think I should just bring up, if only to play devil's advocate. One, that Dave Askins did raise at a certain point, and it might have been in that resolution, the draft resolution, kind of acts as a report card for city council, which, in a way, ideally speaking, I kind of like. I just don't know how much of that burden we want to take on. And in specific, he pointed out that, at the last time that we met, that it was one of city council's responsibilities to do an evaluation of the city administrator, and because he monitors these things very closely, he observed that that had not occurred. That didn't turn out to be a factor in what we decided last time, and quite honestly, I think the burden of trying to evaluate how city council has discharged its obligations is probably beyond what any of us want to take on. But I thought I would mention it because there is that factor. Normally when you're talking about giving somebody an increase, you can talk about they're going to get the equivalent of a cost of living increase regardless, or it can be based on merit. And I'm just going to say out loud, trying to base it on merit is a bit challenging.
I could be wrong, but I sort of feel like merit is based on the voters.
Yes.
If they feel like you're doing a good job and you should have the job, you're voted into office or you're voted out. And I don't think it's necessarily our responsibility as this commission to take on that burden. I do understand the report card consideration, that sort of thing, but in terms of their compensation for their efforts or for their time, I think let's take on that.
Sure. I agree
Yeah,
with
I
that.
would agree. I think, once you start trying to decide whether city council is doing a good job or not, you enter into politics, which, is pretty impossible to be objective about.
Yes.
Yeah, so personally, I would be against, a formula to lock into to say, okay, well, the formula said it's gonna be X, and we all say, okay, great, and walk away. I think it's good to have a formula to turn out maybe a straw man, if you will, to look at that and then kind of see how that makes sense. But, as long as we can talk about things and adjust things, I'd be okay with that. I think the other point that I was gonna make too is that if it's not, most pay systems are either about market or merit or, keeping people whole, based upon inflationary moves. And if it's not about merit, then it should be more, in my view, about fairness. And fairness by looking at the CPI, by looking at what other people have received in terms of increases. The question would be, well, if, we felt good enough about the non-exempt group or about the collective bargaining groups to do X, then why wouldn't we do that for council? And there could be a good reason, but to me, those would be good parameters to look at, and then we could step back and say, well, okay, that we've kind of had this out, this all makes sense, maybe it's not quite here, but it's here, but, I don't know, anyway, have more of a discussion to arrive at that point.
One of the concerns that was voiced last time, possibly by me, is that we still had a lot of people working for the city who were struggling with the aftermath of the recession. And we wanted to be careful that in considering an increase for city council members and the mayor, that we didn't scoot them, at least even, the perception of being scooted past the actual gains that city workers had been able to make, those that were left, after the recession cleared itself up. And so they were still recovering. And I think that is, to answer your question, I think that is a very germane concern, because even if the cost of living has increased, say, 2%, if the wages of the city workers have not increased commensurately, that is a concern. It has to have a context.
Yeah, and I think that goes to this point of,
Right.
looking at the fairness part of it
Exactly.
and making that a component. And I totally agree with making that, whatever, if we come up with a formula, it's just a starting point, a
Yes.
discussion point, and then round out the edges.
I think
from
that's a
there.
point well taken. I have absolutely no problem with that perspective.
Yeah, it starts, so we start every 2 years, we start with, okay, here's the baseline, here's what we are starting with. Given everything that's happened, does this make sense? And if we can do it every year, fine. But it makes, I think, the conversation much more focused than saying, well, how do we compare to Grand Rapids or wherever?
So let me throw out one more devil's advocate statement. So there has been renewed discussion among city council members, as you know, about the possibility of an income tax. And it has been discussed alongside, shall we say, enthusiastic proposals about what would happen if the Washtenaw County-wide tax were approved. Because we are a city that we're not chronically short of money, but we always have endeavors that we're trying to sustain, and sometimes sustaining them is a little bit beyond reach. Recognizing that any increase to our local officers is not going to be the thing that triggers the decision to have an income tax, I would just say this is something we have to tread lightly with, because there is a great deal of opposition to that, a great deal of nervousness about, needing to implement an income tax in order to fund things. And again, it's not going to be us, but I just wanted to say it because I know there are people out there that are going to say that.
I have a question for you, Chris. Do you know what percentage of the employees of the city are under the collective bargaining, and what percentage, just in general,
I
are
think it's
outside
about 20% non-union,
non-union?
but I can.
And of course, the council falls outside of that, and they're at the 20%.
Yeah.
So, a thought, is there somebody, perhaps you, that wants to articulate a resolution at this point, with, bearing in mind that we're asking Chris to provide us with more information? Yeah, why don't you,
Okay.
go ahead.
Yeah, I'm not very good at writing resolutions, but I'll try to at least verbalize it, that, the annual increase, of city council, including the mayor, will be determined by the combination of the addition of the consumer price index for the local Ann Arbor area and the average non-union employee increase the previous year of city employees divided by 2 as a starting point. Does that
To take effect
to
July
take effect
1.
July 1st of the next year, or the July 1st after this meeting? Is that, it's not very, but I think that's the point we're trying to get across.
Do you want to postpone this consideration of this resolution until you get that information?
Oh,
And then do
yes.
it at the second
I-
meeting?
I-
Okay, so that might be the
but
easiest way.
definitely.
I wanted it articulated so
Yeah.
that we know what's on the table,
Yeah.
and I think we're
Yeah.
saying that part 2 of that is that if we can, if we can survive narrow statutory interpretation, that we would actually like to do this on an annual basis.
Yes.
Okay.
Just for the sake of wordsmith fun, do you want to say determined by or guided by? Because I think we had talked about using it as
Guided by
guidelines
is a
as
good
opposed
change,
to
yes.
being an official
Yes.
determination.
Excellent, yes.
Because we may choose, if there are 2 figures and one is lower, we may choose to go with a lower figure. And always with the proviso that anything that we recommend is subject to the approval of the council
Sure.
members themselves. Okay. So that's kind of the draft resolution. I
Mhm.
think we're all in agreement with that as sort of drafted verbally.
Mhm.
So it looks like the next thing is decide is when you're going to be able to provide that information to us and when we
So-
should come back.
Yep, so we need to have this done in 45 days from, calendar days from today, per the statute. So I would suggest you all pick a time that you can meet again, that's convenient for you.
Did you say within 45 days, or?
Yes.
Within 45 calendar days of today. So for the next meeting, pick a time that's convenient for everyone, and we can have that information and a redrafted resolution based on that guidance.
And just as a point of order, I believe that you are acting as secretary, is that right?
Yes.
Excellent.
I have another question. I don't know if you can wait, or should I
Why don't you
just
go ahead?
ask it?
Go ahead.
So, per this draft resolution, we're looking at possibly going to a 2-year review process, or an annual review process as opposed to a 2-year. I guess if we threw that up to council, council could say, well, we're not gonna do that.
Yes.
That's all gotta be approved.
Yep.
Got it.
Chris, just an addition. I think it'd be useful, when you bring back this information, if you could also give us the increases in the union wages by the collective bargaining increases, just so we have something to compare it to.
Yeah, and just because those contracts are concluded at different times,
Right.
it's going to be a little funky.
Maybe you
Yeah.
could give us the effective date of the contract change.
Okay, so you want all the union?
How many unions are there?
That I don't know off the top of my head, but it's probably in the neighborhood of 10 or more.
I think for at least this time, it would be useful, just so we.
AFSCME is the
context.
largest, if
Yeah.
if you wanted to look at one, but I'm happy to look at all of them if you'd like.
If it's not inconvenient, why don't you just give us all? I mean, we
Okay.
can always choose to ignore or condense or whatever. So back to the question of timing. Today is Wednesday. Does Wednesday normally work for people?
Yeah.
Okay.
Good for me, yeah.
I actually am not available on Wednesday until October 11th, but that would be well within the time period. How does October 11th work for people?
Fine.
Available?
Same time, same station, October 11th?
Okay, for me.
Okay, let's just actually vote on that. Move that we adjourn to October 11th at 1 PM. All in favor?
Aye.
I skipped the second. Okay, is there anybody opposed? No. All right, be it done then. I should say continue rather than adjourn, but, so we're on for October 11th at 1 o'clock. And you will have that information to us by that time.
And will that be in this room as well?
Yes,
Okay.
assuming it hasn't already been scheduled, but I will check it for that immediately.
All right.
And are there posting requirements relative to the Freedom of Information Act? I'm assuming you take care of that.
Yeah, we'll post that as soon as we get the room cleared and everything.
Yeah, okay.
And so just so I understand, in addition to the non-union and union compensation, you'd like CPIs for City of Ann Arbor. Do you also want the regional, state, national
Yeah,
CPIs
probably for the last 2 years,
for the last 2 years?
but they can be, the annual number, we don't need monthly numbers.
Okay, and then the formula is gonna be the average of, do you want me to go ahead and try to put that in the formula, not including the union compensation?
Let's start there.
Okay, and so that'll be whatever the annual increase divided by 2
Yeah.
for each year?
Yeah.
Okay. I will take a stab at that,
See what we have.
and you're welcome to change it if it's not to your liking.
And so let me take it one step further. We, of course, have the goal of eliminating paper to the extent necessary, and one of the things we found last time with having all the information about the surrounding communities was that it was a lot of paper. I would like to say that based on what we're talking about today, no need to provide us with all of that information unless we ask for it. That way we can kind of keep the pool of necessary information small. Is that acceptable to everybody?
Well, could you email that information to us like
Yeah,
you did with the others?
what I would do is email everyone and also post it in Legistar so it's available to the public. And
That'd
so
be
if
great.
anyone wants a paper copy, ask me, otherwise I'll assume that nobody wants one.
But what I'm actually talking about is the extra information that we received about other communities, other pay
Mhm.
scales and so forth. And what I'm saying is, we didn't find it helpful. Does anybody see a reason for that to also be provided?
I actually liked looking at that. I thought that was
Okay.
helpful.
All right.
The email version is fine, the electronic.
Okay.
But
All
that
right.
was helpful for me.
Tried to make your job easier, but never mind.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And might it be possible for you to get us this by, say, that Monday before the meeting, the 9th?
Oh, yeah.
Just give us a couple
Yeah,
days
yeah,
to look
yeah.
at it ahead of time.
Yeah, definitely.
Is there any other discussion that should be had?
Yeah, one other question. So relative to the demographic breakouts, it may be helpful too to look at, I mean, I don't know how diverse the contracts are relative to increases, but if you had, 90% of the group was getting a 10% increase, I mean, the averages and weighted averages are, I think, relevant. So knowing the number of people covered under those agreements, I mean, even if it was just an estimate, broad form would be helpful.
Yeah, I think there may be a police officers union that has like 3 people in it or something like that. So,
Hopefully there are more than that. Okay. Does that pretty much cover it? Any last comments from anybody? I think we've done extraordinarily well. We were under an hour.
Great leadership, that's what.
Oh, thank you. Well, I think I probably skipped a couple of Robert's rules, but anyway, I move that we end the meeting. Second?
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
We're done.